No.
Yeah, I still love that AJ Styles theme, man.
Me too.
Yeah. Hey, now it's overtime with Mike and JD. I'm your host, Mike Gilbert. I'm joined as always by JD. I'm not gonna do the full intro. This is just our kind of our Patreon. This is like our us hanging out with our friends type of deal, man. But we got a really cool thing to talk about this week. You wrote an article earlier this week
Did
for the Patreon. It ended up going to Voices of Wrestling too, so it got spread out wide. But you did release it on Patreon first. So yeah, and the title of the article was "Greener Grass: Why Bookers from the Past Aren't Always the Best Solution," and it was in
shit
reference
title.
to.
It's a
It was in
shit title.
reference.
Should have
I
been.
like it.
I
Yeah.
shouldn't. I thought it was like super genius at the time, and then I saw when Rich put the version for the voices out. I was like, that title fucking blows, man. I was really disappointed in that.
but it was in reference to this dipshit from NoDQ.com. NoDQ is kind of an aggregate site, but I guess they kind of let anybody write opinion pieces for their site. They have a huge following too, by the way, like on Twitter. But they're one of those they buy their followers.
Yeah, they buy their followers, man. It's not real.
They have followed me about 12 times in hopes that I would follow them back, and I just never do.
I blocked them because I got tired of them asking, like doing the same gag, and I got no time for that shit. Block.
Yeah. So they had this this article, and why don't you go ahead and tell us what the article was about?
So the article is basically about how AEW is a gigantic failure. And you read these things all the time from people. And I'm going in there and it's like, oh, everything is bad. The show is bad. Tony can't control his locker room. And it's like, there's kernels of truth. But then he was like, he needs to hire people who know what they're doing. He is inexperienced. He needs to hire people who knows what he's doing. And he referenced Dutch Mantell, Vince Russo, Eric Bischoff. Who else was in there? Just who's who of failures.
Yeah.
And like I read this and I'm like, so AEW's been around for 4 years at this point. They didn't sell at Wembley. They had a good number, debatable, at Wembley Stadium. They're about to get $1 billion TV deal. Tony Khan is more successful than any of these guys.
Yeah.
Tony Khan is the second most successful booker of the modern era at this point. Right?
I mean, I'm sure there's some folks that can argue about the, Japanese bookers and things like that. But as far as our country,
Americans,
domestically, it would be him. Of the last 30 years, it's him and Vince, right?
Yeah, it's him and Vince. Like, excuse me. Like you could say Kevin Salt because Eric didn't book anything. Eric wasn't a booker, and like when all these guys have had second cracks, it's all failed. Like AEW has outlasted Smoky Mountain. Right. And most of when people look back on Smoky Mountain fondly, you're talking about 92, 93. By 94, they're bringing in WWF guys and Cornette's tanked the company. Right.
Yeah.
And then Cornette got his second chance booking Ring of Honor and managed to do worse than the guy that came before him, who was Adam Pearce, actually. Like he managed to not do as well. So it's like all these, and Dutch Mantell, like you can't tell me you were watching this stuff in Puerto Rico. And I can tell you when he was running TNA, it wasn't as good.
Yeah,
right.
Well, he was basically Jeff Jarrett's second hand, so he was part of creative, but Jeff Jarrett was booking the company. Dutch was just a guy giving ideas. Vince Russo and Jarrett was in charge. Vince and Dutch worked for Jarrett. There were times where Dixie made Vince outrank Jarrett, but for the most part, it was Jarrett, Dutch, and Vince.
Yeah, pretty much. And it got me thinking about how when I remember when I wrote a piece for not Fight Game for who the hell did I used to work for?
Fansided.
Thank you. Fansided. And it was the same time, it's similar. That was when Vince hired Eric Bischoff and Paul Heyman to run Raw and SmackDown. And I said it's not going to work. And I wrote a big thing about how Eric coming into TNA. Now that didn't work. And that experiment lasted like 4 months. And then Vince was like, no, they're gone. And then this one, it got me thinking about this guy because again, it was a terribly written, terribly researched article. Like the guy was calling for Action Bronson to get fired. That is not a person.
and if he's talking about Action Bronson doesn't work there. So that'd be easy to fire a guy.
Doesn't work there. Action Andretti does work there. Somehow he conflated the two and demanded that that person be fired. It was just like this is the the most poorly researched article and written article that I've ever read. But it inspired me to talk about, because he's not alone. This isn't like the first time someone has said this. Like every time something happens, they want, Freddie Prinze on it. He wanted Freddie Prinze to see that Freddie Prinze should book the promotion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I got to thinking about, like, people want the voices from when they think wrestling was good to still be involved. And it made me think that back in the early 90s, when WCW became a thing, the constant call from there was two people the news writers were demanding should book WCW. One was Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, who shot himself in the foot everywhere he went, but he had the newsletter writers in his pocket so he could get them to sing his praises whenever he want. And he wasn't that great of a booker, I'll tell you. I mean, he was all right, but I mean, like, go back and watch some of those what was the name of that promotion he booked? Continental, those CWF shows. Ain't good. I'll tell you that for a fact. And that was going to be like his thing. So the other one was Bill Watts. And for years, because in 1984, when Bill Watts got his big shot, when he was put on TBS TV, because Ted Turner was mad at Vince for not doing an Atlanta show. So he gave a crack to Ole Anderson's new Georgia promotion, and he also put Mid-South on. And when the WWF was getting hot in 85, the number one show on television, cable TV, was Mid-South Wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
And because we talked about it last year, we both did like a rewatch of 84 Mid-South. The show was great. Like, it was
fantastic.
absolutely great. Watts wasn't booking though at that.
No,
that was Bill Dundee that was booking.
Yeah,
that
from
show.
Memphis. So, and if you like the early days of AEW, it was very heavily influenced by 1984 Mid-South. Like tons of like run-ins, hot finishes, things like that. Like, beatdowns before the bell. You know what I mean? Like AEW. Tony Khan, he's inspired. He's got a lot of inspirations when it comes to his booking. Obviously, very inspired by Bill Watts' Mid-South. There's some TNA influence there. There's some ECW influence. And of course, he's probably a little bit influenced by Vince. He tries to take the good that they all do. Yeah, he tries to take the good that they all do and incorporate it into his company, which I think is smart. But I think the overall tone had a lot of 1984 Mid-South and like 1996, 1997 WCW Nitro with the party-like atmosphere that they had in the early days of AEW Dynamite. The influences are there. So I would strongly recommend people go out of the way to go watch that. It's on YouTube. There's a playlist out there. So.
There's playlists out there. The network, the Peacock, has all those shows, but it's not the same because you don't get the unlicensed music. And part of the fun of Mid-South is the unlicensed music. It's watching Junkyard Dog come out to Another One Bites the Dust. It's like it's listening to the Rock and Roll Express come out to ELO. Like, the music is a big part of it. So you lose a big something when you don't watch the pirated shows. But anyways, Watts was a smart man in that he always, like, when his territory first got hot in the early 80s when Junkyard Dog, he had Ernie Ladd booking the show. So that was good. And then he did his deal with Memphis, right? That they traded. I believe they traded Rick Rude, and maybe King Kong Bundy. Yeah, King Kong Bundy to Memphis for the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette. So they had this legit trade, and then with them, Bill Dundee came in, right? So Bill Dundee took all his Memphis influence and mixed it with Bill Watts's, legitimate tough guy stuff, and it made for just great TV, right? So they're hot on TBS in the 80s. Big event. And if you go back and, like I said, you watch an episode of 1984 Mid-South from the same week, pick an episode of Championship Wrestling, WWF, even pick an episode of Crockett. There's not even a comparison. Mid-South is far and away the better show. Far and away. So absolutely. Watts, so when shit went south was going south with Vince and Ted Turner, Watts thought he was going to get the spot. He thought he was going to get that World Championship Wrestling. When I say World Championship Wrestling, I'm not talking about WCW. I'm talking about the show, the 605 time slot. That was the TV show was called World Championship Wrestling. It was called World Championship Wrestling when Georgia had it. It was called World Championship Wrestling when Vince had it. And it was called World Championship Wrestling when the guy that swept in from underneath Watts' nose and bought the spot from Vince, and that was Jim Crockett. Jim Crockett bought it, and that's why the company was called WCW, because the name of the show that had been on since the late 70s was called World Championship Wrestling. They even had the same intro for all three promotions. That like,
it was kind of like Wide World of Sports or something like that, where
very much.
It was like the same, and then they would just kick it to the current wrestling promotion that had the time slot, right? So they kept all of the other stuff the same, just the promoter and the wrestlers would change over time because different people would get in on the time slot.
Right. So when Crockett makes his deal to come on to TBS, he buys the spot from Vince, very famous $1 million. Hope you'll choke on that million. And he kind of did. And they thought that Watts was pissed because Watts I'm the guy who brought the ratings. Crockett is just coming out of nowhere. Fortunately, Crockett gets super hot in 85. Like everything clicks when Crockett goes to TBS. Like it's crazy. Watts still had his syndication network. Like Watts had syndicators. Like he followed the WWF model, and he had syndicators across the country. And he's like, we're going national. So he was doing his own thing. Eventually in 86, he rebrands to the UWF. So I don't think it was a good move. It was kind of the beginning of the end.
Yeah, but I can see why he did that though, because like they wanted it to seem bigger. Like they didn't want to be like a regional promotion, because it would be like World Championship Wrestling, and then they were called Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling or Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. So no, you don't want that, because this is going out all over the country. So you want that bigger vibe and the bigger feel. So I get why he did that.
The problem was calling it UWF, which sounds exactly like WWF, but the universe is bigger than the world. Same rationale Vince uses on his belts currently. So it was a bad. I get why he did it. He should have picked a different title. Anyways, by early 86, the Oklahoma oil economy completely collapses, and they just aren't selling. They aren't selling tickets to the shows in the home markets, and that's the lifeblood of the company.
Well, and they lost JYD.
That happened way earlier. That happened. I mean, that happens in 84. Like they're hot. Like when they're the number one show in TV, JYD is gone. Like and this is what Watts did well, is he booked, like they left JYD, but they're still selling. They do great business after JYD leaves because they have the Rock and Roll Express. And then when the Rock and Roll Express leaves, they have Hacksaw Jim Duggan. The problem is he couldn't let go of JYD. So he had he kept trying to make the next black baby face, and it never works. Right. But at the same time, they had guys who were drawing. Like the Rock and Roll Express in particular were huge main event draws for that company. Right. They had Hacksaw Jim Duggan, huge main event draw. The problem is when Duggan leaves, they try to make Dr. Death the next guy, and it doesn't quite work. Right. So by
Dr.
the end,
Death just wasn't ready for the spot yet.
No, he wasn't there. He wasn't ready.
And they still had DiBiase pretty much till the end.
Top heel. He was the top heel.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good. It's still a good show, but by the end, like they have Michael Hayes books and Eddie Gilbert books at the very end, and eventually Jim Ross negotiates a deal where they sell the UWF to Crockett. Crockett buys it and takes the network, and then so Watts, the idea that not even Watts, but Jim Ross pitches Jim Crockett was we could have the Super Bowl wrestling. UWF has its show. WCW or Jim Crockett has its shows once a year. We come together, big event, and Dusty didn't let it happen. What they did was they took Watts's offices in Dallas and moved the company to Dallas and spent way more money than they had to, and then they were broke 6 months later and had to sell to Turner. So not quite like the Ring of Honor situation with Tony Khan, more like Vince. It's closer to Vince buying WCW that we talked about last time. So anyway. Watts sells, and then he is gone from pro wrestling for 5 years. And in that time, all these newsletter readers who have fond memories of Mid-South Championship or Mid-South Wrestling are saying, you know who WC should bring to run WCW? You know who should bring to run WCW? Bill Watts. Bill Watts would do a great job here. And Dave was chief among them, quite frankly, at that time. And then it happened. WCW hired Bill Watts to run the promotion at a time that they were starting to get more popular, because Hurd leaves in the summer of 91 after the Flair debacle. The company is at its absolute lowest. And by mid-92, they're starting to turn things around. They're starting to do better. And Bill Watts comes in, and Dave put it the best. Dave said, at that point, I realized Bill Watts had not watched wrestling in 5 years. And if you watch pro wrestling from 1987 and compare it to pro wrestling from 1992, it's a different world.
completely different world. And he's not booking just one TV show. WCW had several TV shows,
Mhm.
all over TBS at the time. They weren't on TNT yet, but they had the Saturday Night Show. They had WC Worldwide, WCW Pro, main event too. Was main event still around? Yeah, so they had four shows plus Clash of the Champions and their pay per views. So they
And
had a lot.
well, Worldwide was on syndication, right? So
Yeah.
Worldwide was on syndicated markets across the country. Main Event had its own show in Chicago on top of the TBS one. Like, 'cause we had a special version of Main Event here. Like,
Oh, really?
that was Chicago centric. Yeah, Jack Brickhouse and Tony Schiavone would do the wraparounds, and it was a different show. It was meant for here. It's kind of cool. Didn't really work, but yeah. So they're like 4 or 5 shows that Watts setting. Now Dusty Rhodes is the booker, and right away Watts comes in and he makes all these ridiculous changes both on camera and off.
Yeah, my
Guys
my
aren't.
favorite
Go ahead.
my favorite one. You didn't want guys jumping off the top rope.
Yep.
that was like the kicker. I was like, why? Like of all the rules to make, why that rule?
Because that was the rule in Mid-South. They had these big dudes who, like, you jump off the
Yeah,
top, you could kill somebody. 3 months earlier, Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger have the best North American match in a decade. And
Super
those
Brawl
2 are
1992.
flat
Yeah,
Super Bowl 92, and those fuckers are jumping all over the place.
yeah.
It was always you can't throw a guy over the top rope. But then Watts decides that having the mats circling the ring makes the guys look soft. So he takes those away. And he changes the work style. And then, well, okay. So he changes the work style. He puts all these rules in. You have to show up when the show starts. You can't leave till the show ends, regardless of where you are on the card. Like, he puts all these ridiculous rules into place. So the guys immediately hate right away. But the interesting was he was going to get the store. It's never been official, but it's speculated that Bill Watts was brought in to get the spending under control, and he would get a bonus based on how much money he could cut from the budget. So the first person he goes after is Brian Pillman, who signed this big deal. He was going to be the star of the junior heavyweight division, and he said, "We'll keep your push going if you take a pay cut." And Brian Pillman said, "Fuck you. I will be the highest paid. I will be the highest paid jobber in history." And
Yeah.
he was for like 3 or 4 months. He lost
Mhm.
everything. And that fucker did not care. Like, because he was getting paid. And it was pretty bad. Eventually they turned Pillman heel and the rest is history. But I mean, and about a month into the Watts tenure, everybody figured out that, oh my God, he's out of touch.
Yeah,
That's all.
you can't. I don't know. You can't not watch wrestling for 5 years, and then try to bring in ideas from 5 years ago as if they're still current and relevant. You can bring in like templates and things like that, but you have to modernize those things. You have to update those things. It's true in any type of business. You don't. Sometimes you got to take a couple steps back so you can go forward. You don't want to take 5 years worth of steps back. You know what I mean? It would be like the New York Jets ran the shotgun offense in the 70s. It'd be like Vince Lombardi coming in there and say, "Oh no, we're only doing running plays and you're only going to throw it 10 times a game," and then trying to win a Super Bowl. It wouldn't actually work. He took his ideology over to, I think, the Redskins, and he didn't do so well over there because he was a little bit out of touch. His ideas were from the 60s, but he's got to coach for the 70s. You got to update your style, right? You got to continue moving forward and continue thinking forward. And you got to make sure that you don't have to watch everything, but your scouting department is watching all these other different areas and finding out what the new cool hip things are. Something that he was doing in 1984. He was one of the guys, early adopters of bringing in like rock and roll music and, bringing in the girls, the Rock and Roll Express. Who else did pretty well in Mid-South was the Fantastics and things like that. But those guys, the way they looked in 1992, like that style didn't really work anymore. They're like the little teeny bopper tag teams. They didn't really, work anymore in 1992. So you have to update those things. And not only was it his idea of what wrestling should be, it was the way he treated people was obviously way behind the times, because now he's going from this little regional territory where he is the end all be all, but now he's going into Turner and he's got a ton of bosses. And it turns out that this redneck from the South said some pretty racist shit and they found out about. I think Wade Keller did an interview with him, and he
So
said some pretty horrendous stuff.
it was Mark Madden, but it was a torch talk
Mark,
with Mark Madden,
yeah,
and Madden gets him to because Bill Watts is this. Bill Watts was like a libertarian before libertarianism was like, I don't want to say cool because I don't think it's ever been cool, but I mean, like, there was a time about 10, 15 years ago where, people who were libertarian were like the edgy people. I'm a libertarian. I have like I have like a social conscience, but I believe in like cutting and like you not paying
fiscal
taxes and shit
conservative.
like that.
And
Fiscal
I
conservatism.
just want to own my guns and smoke my weed and hang out with my gay friends. Like that was like a big thing with
That was
libertarians.
yeah, that was what they were
Yeah.
like in the late 2000s. But anyways, so Watts similarly, like Watts, the guy who was known as the first dude to push black men to the top of his promotion. He did it with Ray Candy in the late 70s. He did it with Junkyard Dog. He did it with Hacksaw Butch Reed. He comes to WCW, and out of nowhere, Ron Simmons, who's a mid-card guy, beats Vader for the world title.
Mm-hmm.
Like Vader had beaten Sting a month earlier, and then like it was great. They're gonna have the rematch. It's a great angle actually. Sting gets hurt, and they have to do like a lottery. They pick a dude from backstage, and it's Ron Simmons. And Ron Simmons comes out and beats Vader at center stage, and because there's a lot of black kids that would go watch the matches at center
Oh
stage,
yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
Ron Simmons wins, and these kids flood the ring. It's the
Awesome.
highlight. It's the highlight of Watts' tenure at WCW. They never really follow up on it, but in that one moment, that Ron Simmons winning the title is just awesome. It's an awesome scene. This is the same guy that gives an interview to Mark Madden and says stuff like, "Why should I have to? Why should I have to go to? Why should a black guy have any kind of special advantages over a white guy? Why should I have to hire black people? Why should I like these? This I'm just quote. I'm like paraphrasing. He says some ridiculously abhorrent shit, and it's
Yeah.
funny because at Starrcade '92. He's standing in the center of the ring with another Ted Turner employee who was the goodwill ambassador for the Atlanta Braves. Do you know who that was, Mike?
The greatest baseball player that ever fucking lived in Hank Aaron.
That would be correct, Hank Aaron. And
Yeah.
then Mark Madden, the eternal shit stirrer that he is, sends Hank Aaron his article. So Hank Aaron gets a copy of it, reads it, and is like, "This guy works for us."
Yeah.
And then very shortly, Bill
yeah.
Watts did not work for Ted Turner.
It's crazy because he said all those things, but his actions were different because, yeah, he always pushed black stars because he knew they could draw money. And Ernie Ladd was like his booker for a little while. Like Ernie Ladd was always treated with reverence, but the shit that he said was completely awful. He was just so out of touch, didn't quite
In
understand where the country was.
1992.
Yeah, he was saying shit that would probably fly in the 60s. 1992, it's a different world. You know what I mean? And he just hadn't updated his ideology. And and it was just,
Mike,
awful.
what happened in the spring of '92? Do you recall?
That would be the Rodney King incident, right?
That would be the
Yeah.
riots, not
Right.
the
And
Rodney.
LA riots.
The King and the Rodney King thing happened in '90. The trial spread out, and
Yes.
like so for guys that might be younger, Rodney King was this. We see it too often now, but at the time he was a black motorist that was high, and he was pulled out of his vehicle, and I think it was 6 LA cops.
Six LA cops on camera beat the shit out of this guy. Just
When we
like
say
it was like a
beat
gang style jumping. It was bad.
with it wasn't just fists. I mean, they're using their nightsticks. They are
Yeah.
beating the shit out of this guy. It's unbelievable. And well, actually, if you pay attention, it's perfectly believable.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
this was in 1990. This was unbelievably shocking news because in the late 80s and early 90s, people started having access to portable video equipment. Right. So this dude saw this happening and grabbed his like over the shoulder video camera and recorded the whole thing. It's like 10 minutes long. So these guys go to trial. And I believe they were found not guilty. I don't even think they were
Yeah.
acquitted. I believe they were found not guilty.
Yeah.
And LA burns. Like there were
Yes.
riots in the streets. Like it was, I remember being a little kid. I was like 12 when this happened. And this was major, major news. And this is right around the time that Bill Watts gave that interview to the Torch. Might have been kind of what was on his mind when he was thinking about this stuff, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was just this at this point, he was not only out of touch with wrestling, he was out of touch completely with society. And you want to know who, after he got fired in 1993, who ended up hiring him to come work for him?
That would be Vince McMahon.
Vince McMahon. So even after all the shit that he said, he ended up going into the Hall of Fame later. I guess because they feel like, yeah, because he's Bill Watts, and like his booking style was the antithesis of what he said in that interview, which is why there's such a dichotomy with this guy. He's so hard to figure out. Like,
people
where does
are complicated.
He really stand? Yeah,
People
he's super complicated. Yeah, he's super complicated guy.
Hilarious, because Bill Watts actually ran when WWF was not drawing shit in 95. 95 is the worst year of WWF wrestling ever, up there with 2019. Like, it was awful. And the company is not drawing, and they bring it. So Vince is like, okay, Watts is going to run the company now. Right. And Watts's idea was to build a black baby face. Do you know who Watts's guy that they were going to build the WWF around was?
It'd be Ahmed Johnson.
That would be Mo Adib from the Global Wrestling Federation, one Tony Norris. Bill Watts named him Buck Johnson. Like a young strapping bucks, which was a derogatory term for black men. And
I did not know that.
Yes, he was going to be Buck Johnson. And Vince overruled and said, no.
Yeah.
We'll call him Ahmed. I don't know where they got that one, probably from Ahmad Rashad or something like that, because Vince likes to do that with names.
Right.
So yeah, then it was Ahmed Johnson, and then they had another argument, and Bill Watts quit. There can only the famous quote, there can only be one Titan in Titan sports.
Yeah, and he actually was, guess who worked the audience. I'm JD knows, but so just the audience, just a fun trivia fact, the guy that was working with him in creative at the time was kind of like his understudy was Vince Russo, of all people.
That's true. Yeah, that's 100%. Roundabout, dude, Vince Russo has, say what you want about the guy. He's got a fascinating story about how he got into this company. Vince Russo got into this company because he owned a video store that was sponsoring John Arezzi's radio show. And then Vince, because he was this money guy, got involved in like the production of the show. And then they were going, because Arezzi goes hard against the steroid stuff and the child rape stuff. And then Vince has to meet.
Let's explain who John Arezzi is real quick. So John Arezzi had a radio show in the New York, New Jersey, like the tri-state area called Pro Wrestling Spotlight. And it was actually on FM radio there. And Vince Russo would buy advertising time on the Pro Wrestling Spotlight show for his video store. So he that's how he came up. And so they eventually became partners. They eventually became partners. And I think that they actually put together and sold and got in business with one James E. Cornette on a Midnight Express like highlight video that they kind of put together and got in. So they were actually, like, in a roundabout way, Jim Cornette is partially responsible for the rise of Vince Russo, which the
president of the Jim Cornette fan club hooked up Arezzi and Vince Russo. True story.
It played out on the Jim Cornette podcast when he found that out. Yeah, it was great.
Jim Cornette goes, "It's my fault. All of him in this is my fault." It's like the best come to Jesus moment in podcast history. Like, you could hate Cornette, but that's just an epic moment in podcasting. Anyway, so they're going hard against Titan for all this stuff, Titan Gate. And then Vince McMahon has a meeting with Vince Russo. Russo comes back and goes, "Hey, we're going about this all wrong. We need to be positive with WWF. They want to work with us." And Arezzi's like, "No, these people are fucking scumbags." So Russo kicks Arezzi off his own show.
Mm-hmm.
And that winds up the show eventually fails, and Russo gets a job at the magazine.
Yeah. And I mean, Vince basically, Vince came in, talked to Vince Russo, got Arezzi kicked off the show. That became a WWE Spin Zone show, and then he ended up getting to work on the magazine, and then worked his way up to the company. When he actually got fired from Vince Russo. Now I know we're bouncing around, so we talked Bill Watts to death. There are some WCW 1992 under Bill Watts and 93 that I really liked, by the way. I actually did a WCW Saturday Night rewatch of 92 and 93, and I loved it on a lot
Me
of that
too.
stuff. They brought in Terry Gordy and Dr. Death as from Japan, even though they were all Japan and they had a relationship with New Japan. That was bad. So, but there was a lot of good wrestling, I thought, and that was the rise of the Hollywood Blondes during that time too, right?
Oh yeah. Well, the tag division's awesome. The Steiners and Doc and Gordy is awesome. That rivalry is great. Both guys are out of the company. Everyone's out of the company, and 3 months later. But yeah, you get that's when I became a fan of WCW, was in the fall of '92. So like that is like my prime era. And people are like, oh, it was so bad. But it's like when you watch that stuff, it's as good as what WWF was doing at the time. Like, because most of that product was shit too. But I mean, like, I like WCW 92, 93. I got a soft spot for it. So, and I agree. Some of the stuff that Watts did was all right. The Jake, like Kip Fry hired Jake Roberts, and they brought him in to be the lead heel of WCW. And it starts off pretty good. He has this great attack on Sting. It's not quite as good as the Savage stuff, but what is? That's career shit for both those two. But it's pretty good. And then it ends just bad. It's a great metaphor for kind of where the Watts tenure is. Like there's so much hope going in, and by the end of it, it's just like, oh,
and
shit.
Oh, another little trivia thing about Vince Russo. I don't know why I know so much about that idiot, but
because you host an Impact podcast, my friend.
That is true. So when he got fired from Impact, and like he was brought in early, and then they were gonna early in the NWA TNA days. So he was brought in early, and they were working on trying to get Hulk Hogan there in the early days, and so to prove that they would do business with Hulk, they let go of Vince Russo. Then Vince, I think this was on his first excursion. He was fired there a few times. Then Vince takes some time off. He takes some time away from wrestling. He has not watched WWF and forever WWE, but Vince McMahon brought him in to be on the creative team, and he came in, and he had been separated from the WWE since 1999 at that point. So we're talking like 3 or 4 years. He didn't know shit about anybody on that television show. They brought him into one creative meeting to see what he still had. He had no juice left, and they went ahead and shit canned him and told him,
one day,
thank you, never mind. Yeah, he lasted 1 day. And this idiot from the No DQ site. What should we name this guy or no? I mean, this is Patreon.
I didn't.
Yeah, I don't even remember his name.
On the Patreon, I did not link the article. On the Voices, Rich says we have to link the article. I'm like, do we gotta give this guy oxygen? And Rich's like, it's killing me to do this, but you referenced it, we have to. And I'm like, you're right, I gotta do that. So I honestly forget the guy's name.
This is the Vince Russo that is still stuck into where he thinks that Braun Penny's matches in 2023 would probably do a lot better on pro wrestling television than actual women's wrestling matches, right?
Racist man himself won Vince Russo.
Yeah.
You don't believe me? Listen to this month's Between the Sheets Patreon show. My God, what a racist piece of shit that guy is.
Yeah. He's a horrendous guy. Dutch Mantell, kind of doing a pro-Trump thing, going after Dave all over Twitter. But you know what? If Dutch got hired on as creative, but to head creative, probably not. But I don't know about Dutch
too.
Yeah, he's super out of touch. The other name that kind of like he threw out there was Al Snow. In what promotion has Al Snow ever booked that was successful?
He's booking OVW right now, sir.
Yeah, and it's one of the worst shows ever in the history of pro wrestling. It is bad. But they got themselves on a Netflix, as more of a documentary series. I have not watched it, but it's bad.
And the whole show is about how they're about to go out of business every week.
Yeah,
great booking.
It's just he bought that promotion from one Danny Davis, not Dangerous Danny Davis, but what was his Smoky Mountain name? Danny Davis. Nightmare Danny Davis. Yeah. So they bought it from him, took it over, and it has done jack shit. The only reason anybody ever knew about it is because it was the WWF. It was like their exact first, because Memphis
was their first. It was their first one that they kind of owned outright and built. They bought. They didn't even own it. Actually, I take it back. They were just working with Danny. They just like, Danny Davis is a really good trainer. What if we send all our guys to work with Danny Davis? And he was smart enough to have his school open at the same time. So he would get this mixture of guys. Like there were a lot of people who got WWE contracts who started out in Danny Davis' school.
Yeah. Then, but once WWE pulled, Yeah, once WWE pulled out of there and stopped sending blue chip athletes over there, they didn't really produce anybody anymore. Not to say they're not good trainers, but they're like, can you name anybody from the last 10 years that's kind of come out of that school with, I can't. Not to say that Rip Rogers can't train, right? I'm sure Allison knows how to wrestle, but he never drawn no money.
Honest to God, the only person that's come out of there that people know is Layla Gray for being Jade's second in AEW.
Okay, I don't actually know who that is, but I'm sure
remember when Jade had her baddies? Not Red Velvet, not Kira Hogan, but the other one.
The other one. Okay, so one of the baddies. Yes. Okay,
that's it.
Okay,
that's all we got.
Right. All right. Yeah. So that was the other name. So look, it is good sometimes to kind of go back to the past and bring in some of the ideas. Go ahead, JD.
Really quick, do you know who the main player in OVW is right now?
It's Jesse Goddard's, isn't it?
Jesse Goddard's. You know Jesse Goddard, Mr. Spectacular. He probably follows everybody who listens to this show on Twitter.
He's followed me 17 times and I never follow back. Yeah.
I did follow him. That's how I know this. Do you know who he's currently working with?
Oh, it's EC3 because I saw the clip of Dixie Carter.
It's EC3, and EC3 turns out like flirting with white nationalism was not good for EC3's narrative. He's back to being Ethan Carter III.
Yeah. And you know what? Good for Ethan Carter III because I think he's looking at MJF doing his gimmick. That's the EC3 gimmick. He's doing it better than EC3 ever did it. But he stole the gimmick, right? And he just did it better than EC3 did. I think that that poor Ethan Carter, man, he left a lot of money on the table when he decided to go to the Control Your Narrative stuff. Now he's the NWA champion, but that can't really pay you too much.
That doesn't mean anything. I don't care where Tyrus is ranked in the PWI 500. Like that doesn't. Tetsuya Naito was not on the PWI 500. You're gonna tell me that fucking Billy Starks is better or more valuable than Tetsuya Naito?
Wait, Billy Starks is on the PWI 500?
Yeah, you wrestle intergender matches. You get to be on the PWI 500.
Okay, so the men that wrestled her, are they going to be on the women's list? Is that how it works?
I mean,
I mean, for equality, right?
I mean, I don't know, man. I don't know. Anthony Bowens isn't on the list either. He's a current champion in AEW, and he's actually a good worker.
Yeah,
not on the PWI 500. Will Ospreay, not in the top 10.
And he's the best wrestler in the world. I'm so glad that we didn't touch on that on the main show because I probably would have got myself in trouble. Yeah.
I'm glad. That's why I'm bringing it up now. Like, PWI is a kayfabe list. Love Warren Hayes. I love you. But, yeah.
Oh, does Warren Hayes do the PW? Is he like a voter?
He said, I like Warren. Warren's a good dude.
Yeah.
He said, I am not responsible for this, but I did help contribute to it. But I cannot speak for all of these because I know Warren even's like, this is ridiculous. Some of these things.
We should bring him on sometime and say, hey, Warren, did you at least think of Naito? Like, did he cross your mind? Warren,
did you watch the G1 by chance?
Yeah, because he was. Did you watch the Forbidden Door? He was on that. And he was in a pretty big
I can't blame Warren for this. Like,
no,
I'm sure he's pulling the. I know he's a good dude. He knows wrestling. I'm sure he's pulling the hair out of his head looking at this list. Because again, Masha Slamovich on the PWI 500, Tetsuya Naito off the PWI 500.
Yeah, and Masha's great, by the way. But I just think it's weird to have a women's list.
Tetsuya Naito, man.
No, she's not. But I just think. Am I the only one thinks it's weird that to have like a women's list and then put women on the men's list, which I guess maybe it's just not a men's list. But if that's the case, then you should integrate all the women, right?
Let me tell you something. We have in the state of Illinois, we have girls wrestling as an official sport now. It is an official IHSA sanctioned sport. Girls can still compete in the boys division. If they want to.
Okay. I mean, I wrestled girls when I was in high school. Some of them, but we didn't have a women's division. So
we have a women's division now, and we're trying to grow our women's division. I don't understand why.
I think it's awesome. Hey, I'm a girl dad. I think fucking girls,
I
kick ass and do sports.
I coach girls at Fargo. Like, I got no qualm with having girls wrestling. It's save amateur wrestling, quite frankly. Like, we are women's wrestling is the fastest growing sport in America. That is a fact. However, the fact that if they're good, they can go wrestle. They can opt out of the girls and wrestle on the boys makes me scratch my head. You know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't get it, but hey, whatever makes people happy, man. Like, I mean, in PWI, it's a kayfabe list. So and you know what? And I saw how much that meant to Masha, and obviously I'm an Impact guy.
Oh,
so,
happy for her.
I mean, that meant a lot. That meant a lot to her. I just found it to be a little bit fun.
Billy Starks' dad was freaking out about it. It's awesome. Like, it's cool because for a lot of these people, it really helps make their career, like Jonathan Gresham.
Well, yeah, yeah. Oh, was he on the list this year?
I'm sure he was, but that was like I don't know, but I hope it's not true. But that was the apocryphal story that was floating around last year when he was yelling at Tony Khan and was quoting his ranking in the stories he was quoting his ranking in PWI 500. I hope that's not true. I hope that's not true.
Yeah, I hope it's not true. But hey, guys, I think that's gonna do it. Again, if you like Overdrive, JD and I kind of get a little weird on this show, but Overtime. Sorry, JD and I like to get a little bit weird on this, but we've actually just been doing historical topics. So if you got a topic you want us to talk about, we're game.
Yeah.
Give us ideas. Tell us what to talk about. We'll do some research. JD kind of has a lot of this knowledge off top of his head already, but we'll read into it, we'll look into it, and then we'll talk about it, man. So give us some ideas. But hey,
we got no ideas what we're talking about next week. So hey,
yeah,
you got
yeah. But hey, guys, that's gonna do it for us on Overtime this week. And until next time, mahalo.